Hello all. So we've completed calf management, pre-weaning calf management and weaning, and now we move on to the second topic of the lecture series, which is heifer management. But I can assure you that the rest of the dairy management topics are not going to be as long as heifer management. I'm sorry, calf management, because we spent a lot of time on calf management, trying to address different issues from all the way from calving to weaning, right? So that took a lot of time. But from this point onwards, it should not be such a long process, right? Okay. So before we start on the management aspects of heifers, now let me ask you, what do you understand by the term heifer, right? So usually we use the term heifer to describe a female bovine, of course, that has not what? That has not calved, or that has not had the first calf, or had not that has not had an offspring, right? However, once it gives birth, right, to the first calf, the heifer becomes a, a cow, right? So a heifer essentially is a young bovine female that has not calved, right, not had her first offspring, but after the first calving onwards, we call that animal a cow, right? So there would be, uh, first parity cow versus, then multi-parity cows, right? So theoretically, even from day one, a female calf can be called a heifer, right? But typically we use the word heifer to describe an older animal, right? So theoretically we can call them pre-weaning heifers and post-weaning heifers, right? So this is what I'm going to focus on under lecture topic 2, right? So under topic 1, which was calf management, I mainly talked about pre-weaning heifers, and from this point onwards I'll be talking about post-weaning heifers, right? And post-weaning heifers, for ease of um, management, we categorize them into three groups. One is from weaning to 9 months, right? So weaning, we all know, we can't define as 8 weeks or 10 weeks. It depends on the management system, right? So we categorize it as weaning to 9 months, 9 months to 15 months, and 15 months to 24 months, right? So by now you should know which special events are symbolized by these age groups, right? So something important happens at 24 months, and then something important happens 9 months before that, right? So those should go in these two blanks. And why exactly is 9 months important? Well, 9 months is considered important because it is during this phase that the skeletal muscular growth development can take place. It's most critical. It can take place rapidly if you manage them properly, right? So therefore the feed that you give during this phase is a little different to the feed given during these two phases, right? So that is the fundamental difference between this categorization into three classes. I hope all that is clear. Right. So is heifer management important? Why do we make such a big deal about it? Can't we just say, okay, you do your calf management properly, you wean the animals, then you let them be, because they're not going to give you any milk for the next 1.5 or 2 years, right? So why bother paying so much attention to them? Just leave them, just let them grow as is, and we'll come back to them at breeding age, right? Why don't we do that? Why do we say heifer management is important? think about it. Pause the video and think about it for a minute. Right. So heifer management is important because heifers are essentially going to be the replacement animals for the animals that will be culled. Right. Now, in a good dairy management system, for various reasons which we categorize as voluntary and involuntary culling, which we'll address in future lectures. um, Culling is essential, right? A successful dairy depends on culling, right? If you don't cull, that means you're keeping animals that are either non-productive or infertile or diseased, right? And you're burdening your herd, right? So therefore culling is essential. In an ideal world, all animals will produce excellent milk, all animals will be 100% healthy, all animals will be 100% fertile, right? All animals will live forever. That is not going to happen in reality, right? So in reality, you're going to have animals that get mastitis, and there are others get ruined, fibrosed, and become non-productive. There will be animals that will undergo certain problems during parturition, and then they'll go down as downer cows, and you'll never be able to get them back up. And there will be cows that you cannot get pregnant, right? And there will be cows that gets the odd diarrhea or whatever and becomes weak, right? And so on and so forth, right? So for lame animals, you just there are too many reasons to name right here. So for one reason or the other, there will be non-productive animals that you have to cull or get rid of in the from the your productive herd, right? So typically, in a realistic world, in the Western world, right, so the culling rate is 25 to 30% per annum. That means if you have 100 milking cows, right, 30 cows will go out of that herd every year, which means you need 30 replacement heifers to replace that 30 cows that just left the herd, right? But in Sri Lanka, especially in under government management, for example, the NLDB farms, right, National Livestock Development Board, the culling policy is not that favorable or not aligned with modern dairy management practices, right? So therefore, they keep the less productive and infertile animals in their herds, right? So these animals consume food, but they don't give back. They don't give back as by means of calves or as milk, so they are not profitable on the one hand. And on the other hand, because these when you calculate the average milk production or average fertility for a herd, you're also considering these non or less productive animals, and they bring down the average of the whole farm, right? So in an ideal world, you should stick to this kind of culling rate, and of course you have to have a good replacement stock, right? So these replacement heifers cannot be just any heifers, right? So they have to be good heifers, good animals, meaning that they can they should achieve puberty, the recommended ages, and they should be bred at 15 months. Therefore, they can calve at 24 months. So remember, that is one of the golden principles of dairy management, is you need to get a calf a live birth by 2 years of age, right? 2 years or 24 months. And so if you want an animal to, if you want a heifer to calve at 24 months, the animal has to conceive by 15 months, right? So it doesn't mean it has to, the first breeding is at 15 months, it has to conceive, right? Meaning it has to become pregnant, right? So just because a breeding is done, it doesn't mean the animal gets pregnant at the first breeding, right? So that's why it's important to get them conceived by 15 months, which means breeding may have to start a little earlier, right? So as we all know, cows cycle, every 3 weeks, once in every 21 days, right? So if you want to make sure that your heifer gets pregnant exactly at 15 months, maybe you don't want to wait till 15 months, maybe you start at 14 months, right? Provided that it has fulfilled certain criteria that we will be talking about as the lecture goes on, right? So that it will get pregnant by 15 months, and it will give its first calf at 24 months, right? And that alone is not sufficient. They have to produce high lactation yields. They have to have a high longevity, meaning if it just uh, comes into heat earlier, gets puberty well ahead of time, is very well conceived by 15 months, produces an excellent calf by 24 months, produces 10,000 liters of milk during its first lactation, but then it's going to get mastitis, or because of the high lactation yield, the udder got weak, suspensory ligaments got damaged, and you had to cull the animal. So there was no longevity, right? So the animal lactated only one yield, one round of lactation, and you had to get rid of the animal. So that animal is no good, even though its fertility was good, its productivity was good, but longevity was poor, right? So that animal is not good. So in addition to this, these replacement heifers have to have a high longevity also, right? So same thing goes for health and fertility, right? So animal has all of these but is highly susceptible to babesia, for example, or for milk fever, right? Or lameness. It has bad conformation. The feet are, let's say, for example, crooked. So because of the way the animal keeps its foot on the ground, the hoof, it's prone to damage, right? So that is not good. So because of that damage, high probability for damage of the hoof, it can get easily injured and become lame, and then that lame animal is no good. It's difficult to breed, it's difficult to walk, appetite goes down, right? So productivity goes down, so on and so on and so forth, right? So that is not good either. So that's why your replacement heifers need to fulfill all these criterias, ideally, right? So that is the challenge, right? You don't want any heifer, but you want a high quality heifer that will fulfill all these criteria in an ideal world, right? So remember, these figures that I talked about are not the same for beef, right? So these are for dairy cattle, right? Especially Holstein Friesians, and jerseys. Even jerseys might be slightly different, right? So all these statistics, most of the statistics published on textbooks and journal articles are usually on the breed of Holstein Friesian, right? But in Sri Lanka, we have either Friesian crosses or Jersey cross Friesians or Jersey crosses. And so be aware that these figures may be slightly different, right? But if you take beef breeds, of course, in Sri Lanka does not have a dedicated beef industry with proper beef breeds like Angus and so on, right? So for those breeds, these figures will be different, and you need to be aware of this, because we will question some of these at exams and vivas, etc. Right. So under this lecture, it shouldn't take more than 1 or 2 lectures maximum to cover heifer management. I will be talking under 4 topics mainly. One is, high quality replacement animals, right? What do you mean by high quality animals? then breeding management, feeding management, and housing management of heifers, right? So let's look at the first topic, which is high quality animals. So if it's high quality animals, right, the genetic component essentially has to be good, right? So how do you ensure that? Right, so we'll take a look at that shortly, right? Now, so basically, in the Western dairy industry, whether you take countries like the United States, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, right? So there are two ways by which you can um, acquire replacement heifers. One is you raise them, right? So you're a dairy farmer, meaning you have dairy cows that produce milk and calves, right? And so from the time of birth, you raise them all the way up to calving, right? But and the other method is, you purchase, you can buy them, you don't raise, right? So basically, once a cow calves, right, you'll do the initial management of colostrum feeding and all that, and then you either sell the calves, right, or loan somebody the calves, right? So they will take the calves, do all the heifer management elsewhere. They'll do the weaning, or sometimes they'll do only the post weaning management. You'll do up to pre weaning management, right? And they will raise them elsewhere, not within this dairy farm. And then they will make them pregnant, they will breed them, they will make them pregnant and return to you either as, early pregnant heifers, or when they are close to parturition, right? So these are the two models uh, that exist for acquiring replacement heifers, right? So this is the first model that I talked about, from point of calving to, from point of, being calved, right? From point of birth to, racing and breeding and calving, the dairy farmer will do it himself. The other method is where this will be outsourced, right? This will be outsourced and somebody else will raise them and bring them back to you at a price, right? So those are the two models that are available in the Western world. Even if you think about the Sri Lankan situation, you know, um, some farmers purchase heifers from, other farmers, right? So the typical price of a Holstein Friesian heifer, can be anywhere upwards of 50,000 depending on age and breed and all that, right? Is it a 50% cross? Is it a 75% cross, etc., etc.? And it could go all the way up to even 150,000, right, for a high quality pregnant heifer in Sri Lanka, right? Right. So wherever you do it, whether you raise them yourself or whether somebody else raises them, so heifers typically will look like this under, spring and summer conditions. They might stay outside. Of course, during winter, cold, very cold winter, they will be housed inside, right? And so heifers will be raised from this stage to this stage. So these are, obviously not heifers, either late pregnant heifers with udders, or, they're cows, right? But then the farmer, the dairy farmer, will purchase them as a group, right? That is one option. And of course, the other option is, some farmers, as a hobby, they will buy these very high quality, elite animals, right? So these are basically the two buying options available in these Western countries. Either, like regular animals, right? So even though we call them regular, I'll show you in a minute that there are methods of identifying, better than average animals, right? Or you can buy extremely high quality prize winner animals also at cattle shows, etc. Right? Right. So I just wanted to give you an overview of the two main methods. I just wanted to make sure you understood that because in Sri Lanka, all you see is race, right? You might think that is the only option, but no, that is not the only option. There is in other worlds, in other countries, there is this option of purchasing uh, raised, already grown up heifers, replacement heifers as well. Right. So whether you raise them or whether you buy them, you have to do something called selection, right? Meaning, let's say if you are racing, right, you don't select 100% of the heifers that were born in your farm, right? So at weaning, right, so we do selection at two time points. The first one is done at weaning, right? You are raising your own heifer calves, right? So you don't want to select every single heifer as a replacement animal, right? You will select the largest heifers, right? Now when I say largest, I mean tall and lean, right? I don't mean fat, right? Stocky, chubby, that's not the animal that we want to select. These animals can give problems, delayed puberty, problems during parturition, so on and so forth, right? So we want to select animals with large frames, right? The skeletal structure is large, tall and lean is the preferred phenotype, right? So they have to be structurally large, right? They have to be physically sound, right? So when I say physically sound, there are certain anatomical, conformation-wise characteristics, right? We also define it as type, right? TYPE type. So we want them to be physically sound, right? There are certain places that we look at, right, to ensure all these the physical characteristics are good, right? We look at the udder, we look at the hooves, and of course at weaning, you may not be able to, you cannot evaluate based on the udder, right? But there are other confirmatory things that we look at, right? And then they have to be structurally large, they have to be physically sound, they have to be in good health, right? And then you have to have good growth potential, right? So it can't be a stunted animal. You have to look at records, if available, of parents and other relatives, siblings, if available, right? And you want to try and select above average producing cows, right? Calves from above average producing cows, right? So that is going to be a challenge, especially if you're buying in large quantities and from outside. Now you all know Sri Lanka imported heifers, from pregnant heifers from Australia and New Zealand from about 2008 onwards, till 2017, 15, 17 was the last batch that landed in Sri Lanka so far. Not 15, 2017, 18, right? And so these animals ideally should have been, you know, selected on these criteria and more, right? But it is difficult to do that when you're importing animals by the thousands, right? So that is important to realize, right? So you don't want to save heifers that are very fat at weaning, for the same reasons I described, or animals that are extremely thin and undergrown either, right? So let's say you have 100 cow enterprise and 30% is the culling rate, right? So you don't want to select exactly 30 heifers, you want to select a little more than that, right? Because a certain percentage will have production or health, reproduction related issues, right? So therefore you want to select slightly higher number, maybe 10% more. So instead of 30, you select 33%. Right. So if calf management was poor in a particular farm and mortality was high, right? Okay, let's go back to this example of 100 milking cows, right? So if 100 milking cows, ideally you will have 100 calves, right? 50% of which will be females, right? So you have 100 cows, 30 will get culled every year, right? So the replacement rate should be 30 heifers per year, right? And you have 50 calves, right? But if your management is poor, then in the first place you are not going to get 100 calves out of 100 cows in 1 year because your management is poor, right? Let's say you get 90 calves, right? So but that's still very good, right? But 90 calves, which means 45 heifers, right? And out of these 45 heifers, there was very high mortality, right? Let's say there was I have seen up to 20% mortality in certain farms, right? But let's say 10% mortality, so 45, you're down to 40 now, right? You are still fine because you only need 30, right? But then what happens, you know, not all of them meet these criteria, right? The farmer doesn't do proper cholesterol management, therefore a lot of calves get, let's say, joint ill, diarrhea, they become poor, growth characteristics, right? Poor conformation, right? And then at the time of weaning, you look at the herd, and out of these 45 that were born, right, 5 died, and then out of the 45 heifers that were born, 5 died, so you have 40. But then you look at the ones that meet these criteria, and suddenly you only have 20 good animals, right? So then what do you have to do? You have no choice but to absorb the poor animals also, those that are extremely fat, those that are extremely small, those that are not in good health, those that have poor physical conformation, right? You are going to have to select all of these, right? And these animals, when they, so although you have the number, right, the quality is very poor. As a result, as time goes by, you're going to have problems with these animals, right? They won't give the quantity of milk or the fertility you expect or the longevity you want from these animals, right? So that's why you want your calf management to be above average and to have low mortality, so that you will have all that 45 calves, and you can select the best 30 or 33 animals out of that 45, and you cull the other 12 animals, and you select the highest animals with the best genetic merit, and your genetic advancement within the herd will be faster, right? So so with this example, I said there are 45 calves, you take 33, right? 12 calves you cull. Now just because you say you cull them, it doesn't mean you send them to the slaughterhouse, right? So although these 12 calves are not good enough for you, for your standards, there will be plenty of smallholder farmers, right, who are willing to raise these calves, right, under a different management system. These animals can be extremely profitable to them, right? So just because I say cull, it doesn't have to be the slaughterhouse, right? They will be, you will be sell them as live calves to some other farmer who will be happy to incorporate that animal into his dairy farm, right? So this is the first step of selection, the first place where you will be doing selection, right? And this is especially true if you are raising your own replacement stock, right? So the second place that you do heifer selection is as yearlings, right? So when we say yearling, we mean an animal that has already lived 1 year, right? So at the end of their first year, you can do a round of selection, right? So if you might be buying them as yearlings, then as the buyer you will do this selection, or even if you are racing them, right, you will still have to do this selection, right? Let's say, so from that initial 45 you selected 35, right? And out of the 35, at the end of 1 year, you see that three animals are not so good for one reason or the other, so you cull them and you keep 32, right? So that's why I said you need to select more replacement heifers than you actually need, right? So then you select as yearlings, right? And again, here you're only selecting the best grown heifers, tallest, leanest, right, largest structure, best physical conformation, all those still apply, right? However, with modern advancements in technology, you also have the option to look into their genetic potential or genetic merit, right? Now, different countries have different criteria to evaluate these genetic merit, right? So in Australia, there are three indices that they use, right? So one is called the Balance Performance Index, then Health Weighted Index, and then Type Weighted Index. In the USA, it's slightly different, right? So they have something called the TPI, which stands for Total Performance Index, which takes everything into consideration: milk production, health, fertility, conformation, so on and so forth, which I will be touching on briefly as the lecture goes on, right? So you want to look for animals with high genetic merit, right? Provided they have been genomically tested, you will get that. You won't find that in Sri Lanka, but in other countries in Europe, the Americas, and Australia, New Zealand, you have this option, right? So they will be slightly more expensive, but as we will discuss later on, you will see that they are more, although they are more expensive, they are, the reliability scores are higher. As such, they are bound to be better producers, better health, better fertility, etc., etc., right? And then, especially if you're importing from a different country, you want to make sure that they are free of certain diseases, right? So for example, in Sri Lanka, if you don't have a particular disease, let's say disease A we don't have, then you want to make sure that the imported stock will be guaranteed free of disease A, right? So you might be aware that with these stocks brought from New Zealand and Australia, we still don't know 100% for sure, but we think bovine viral diarrhea, which was not reported in Sri Lanka before this, might have been introduced by this imported stock. But then it's, right now nobody knows for sure. There are certain reports saying that there might have been BVD before that in Sri Lanka as well, but however, that's up for argument. I just brought out the point to tell you the importance of certification of disease-free guarantee, right? And of course, they have to have, if they have good genetics, then they probably have good milk production capacity, high fertility, high survival and longevity, as I mentioned earlier, high feed conversion efficiency, the conformation, type, anatomy, so these are the things that we have to look for, whether at weaning or as yearlings, right? And if you fast forward a little, right, if the animals have already, let's say by about 15-16 months, all animals should have undergone breeding. And if the animal is repeatedly not becoming pregnant, right, then you might consider culling those animals that are not conceiving, right? So you can breed them with a bull or by artificial insemination, but if they don't conceive by a certain deadline that you set, right, uh, I'm sorry, this should be 20 months, right? So you typically start breeding at 15 months, right? So if they don't conceive within, by 18 months or 17 months or 20 months, whatever the deadline you set, you get rid of them, right? So that is the kind of selection process that needs to undergo as yearlings, right? So remember, first round of selection at weaning and second round of selection as yearlings. Right. So this is an example of animals, advertised for sale, right? So let's zoom in and take a closer look, right? So these are two animals, red Holstein Friesians, obviously. So this guy is called Colt P Red, right? So they have given different information on these animals. So these are genomic evaluations, right? So genomic evaluations. Now you might not be familiar with these terms yet. So there's something called PTA, which stands for predicted transmitting abilities, right? So up until genomic evaluations came, so even genomic evaluations are predictions to a certain extent, because they only have a reliability of about 70%, right? 70 to 80%. If they were 100% reliable, then it won't be a prediction anymore, right? It'll be parameter, I suppose. But initially, the daughter performance was predicted using data from the maternal side and the paternal side, right? So that's why they were called predicted transmitting abilities, right? So the transmitting ability from the mother and the father is predicted, right? So the reliability of these were typically 20, 30 or 35% depending on the trait, right? Certain traits have a higher reliability, whereas certain other traits have a low reliability, right? So when I say traits, it could be milk volume, it could be fat percentage, it could be protein percentage, it could be somatic cell count, it could be, it could be carcass traits, it could be mastitis resistance, right? So all these are different traits, and different traits have different transmitting abilities and different reliabilities, right? So genomic uh, PTAs or genomic or GPTAs have a higher reliability, right? Twice or thrice as much as the phenotypic PTAs, right? Right, so these are genomic evaluators, right? And so PTAM stands for predicted transmitting ability for milk, right? So when you see 824 here, that means this animal gives 824 kilos, right? Higher than the the average of the breed, right? So this animal, see, it's negative 1216, right? So its milk volume is lower than the breed average, right? So it's something like that, right? So that is the fat percentage, see, lower than the breed average, but this guy higher than the breed average, right? So this is total fat, right? Total fat, protein, see this animal, so protein, even though the volume is less, protein and fat percentages are higher, right? So these are genomic data, right? And then you also have on the other side, so there's some information about the dam, right? Is the mother, and maternal grandmother, right? So dam of Cold P Red is Sandy Valley, right? Maternal grandam is Ralma Sandy Storm, right? Sandy Storm I got from here. September Storm, sorry, September Storm, right? So something like that, right? And so it gives some information of the mother, right? So mother, 2x, right? Twice a day milking for 365 days has given 16,000 kilograms lactation yield, 2.8% fat, 457 total fat, 3.3% protein, 546 kilograms total protein. So these were the entire lactation, right? um, right, so it's like this. See 3%, let's say 3%, for example, right? 1% of 16,523 is 165, right? 165 kilos is 1%, so 3% is approximately 165 times 3, right? So we say 16 times 3 is 48, so because this is 2.8, so that's how you get this, right? So this is 3.3, so it's slightly higher, 546, right? Now this guy, right, has lactated only 312 days, right? So 312 days, twice a day milking, it has given less milk than this, the mother, but more fat, right? 3.5% or the same amount of protein, but total protein is less because here the milk volume is lower, right? So same here for this animal, right? Dam and maternal grandmother, right? And then there is also a section on physical trait evaluation. There is a close-up zoomed in version more than this, so let's look at that. All right, so there you go. So that's one of the very famous bulls, right? um, so PTA milk, you know, this is the US system. So I'm not sure if this is kilos or pounds, right? So these might be pounds, that higher than the average, right? Maybe kilos or liters. I'm not 100% sure here, right? Um, and so these are physical traits, right? So the stature, strength, body depth, shallow, dairy form, tight ribbed, rump, high pins, rump width, and so on and so forth. They go through a lot of these things, right? So these are genomic evaluators, right? So genomic evaluations, that's why it has a 73% reliability, right? So these are genomic tested animals, right? So see this guy, this one, rear leg sideways below average, right? So that would be average, breed average of the genomically tested ones. And these are all above average, and this particular one is below average, right? Okay, so the physical traits, so in the good old days, right? So this is what you'll have to do. Physical traits, you have to evaluate them one by one, right? Evaluate them one by one, like this, right? All these different things that you have to evaluate: heel depth, foot angle, dew claw, bone quality, hock, so on and so forth, rump, loin, pin set, body depth, udder attachments, rear udder attachments, you know, all these different things you have to manually evaluate, right? But now all these things can be tested genomically, right? Don't ask me how, but there are methods to do that, right? These are things. Now you and I don't have genomic testing in Sri Lanka, so you have to have a slight, not a slight, you have to have a good idea. If you are going to become a dairy veterinarian, you have to have a good idea about these different anatomical, type related characteristics that distinguish a good animal from a poor animal, right? So for example, so here is a so udder depth, right? So we typically say if the udder goes below the level of the hook, the hock, right? That is not a good sign, right? So they have to be either intermediate or shallow, So I'm not going to go through all of them, so you can go through these slowly, right? So these just regarding the mammary system, and then there are characteristics you have to look at on the feet, right, and legs, right? See, uh, this is called hooked in, right? But that is not a good conformation, right? So you have to be straight like this, side view, heel depth, the rump angles, right? All of these are very important, and I urge you to go to this website, datagen.com.au, right? You can, they have all these different fact sheets, PDFs that you can download, right? And I urge you to go through these and learn all these anatomy related characteristics, right? So using all these, you can calculate breeding values. In Australia, they call them Australian breeding values, right? So they have given the ideal value, right? So that's the ideal for that particular trait, right? So if you have a figure below that, the breed, not ideal, I'm sorry, not ideal, the breed average, right? So the breed average is this, right? So you want to try and select animals with ABVs higher than the breed average, which is this, right? So if it's less than that, I think that's the kind of animal they send to Sri Lanka, right? So you don't want that, right? So this is what I told you earlier. Genomic testing is now 60 to 70% reliable for predicting future performance, compared with just 20 to 30% for phenotypic parental averages, right? So you don't need to um, you know go into a lot of details on these things, but you just need to be aware of these, right? Now as lecturers, there are when we teach you things, there are things that you need to know. There are things that as an undergraduate veterinarian or a master's student, that you need to know, and that are nice to know, and that you are nice to have heard of, right? So these are how you calculate these figures. That is not something you need to know, right? So this you have to have heard of, right, before you graduate. Or if you are practicing veterinarian, you have to know this, you have to have heard of this, you have to know that there is such a thing, right? But unless you're in the breeding industry, you don't need to know this. However, if you're in the breeding division of the DAPH, yes, then for you it's a need to know, right? It's not nice to know, it's not you just have to have heard of it, you need to know, and you have to be able to teach me, right? Because that is what you do, that is your specialty, right? So depending on who you are, right, depending on what you're specializing on, you need to decide, you're the best person to decide to what depth you need to learn this stuff, right? So like I said earlier, in Australia there are mainly three breeding values or indices, right? In indices that they talk about. So one is the balance performance index, health weighted index, and type weighted index. If you look at this, it basically says how the milk production, health traits, and conformation related traits are taken into consideration when calculating each of these. So balance performance index takes uh, gives the highest weightage for milk, right? But when you take health weighted index, it gives a higher weightage for health related traits, like fertility, cell count, type, survival, etc., right? And type weighted index obviously gives highest weight, high weightage to weight. So 23% here versus 14 and 11%. Milk 51% here, 38, 44. So out of these groups, right, I would presume this group, the milk production is highest, right? However, they have the highest probability of getting sick, right? Whereas these guys, health weighted index, okay, all of these are health related stuff, right? So they have the least chance of getting sick, right? So these guys have the best anatomy, structure, type, right? So if you want to raise animals to produce at cattle shows to win prizes, etc., you should pick animals from this index and so on, right? So now I have met certain farmers in Australia that have told me, they don't stick to the same index every year, right? So this year I will select based on so let's say, for example, maybe not replacement heifers, but to get bulls, semen, right? So when I get semen, I will select a bull based on BPI. For 2 years, I will do that. Next year, I will select bulls based on this one, health weighted index. Next year I will select semen based on this, right? So that way, he gets semen from all these different types, right? I personally don't know, scientifically I don't know if that's the right thing to do, but I have been told by Australian large scale farmers that that's what they do. So I presume they are really practical people. I presume it's scientifically acceptable, but personally I don't know, this is not my specialty, right? Okay, so whether you look at the Australian breeding values or the US breeding values or the predicted transmitting abilities or the genomic tested PTAs, any population, if you have done statistics, you already know that there will be animals that are in the middle, the breed average, then there will be the ones that are in the the negative, below average, right? One standard deviations, two standard deviations, 95%, 5%, 2.5%, etc., etc. So ideally you want to try to select these animals, right? So if you're bringing in animals from Australia to Sri Lanka, right, you want to make sure that they have been bred with such semen, right? Or if you have records for both the mother and the father, right? So you want to try and select animals here, right? Of course, these animals will be extremely expensive, right? But at least if you can get this group to a country like Sri Lanka, that will make a whole lot of difference to our dairy industry, right? Right. So like I said earlier, so those were the Australian indices, but in the US they use something a little different. It's called Total Performance Index, TPI. So TPI stands for Genetic or Genomic uh, Total Performance Index. So again, you have all this for milk, for fat, right? For somatic cell count, for protein, and so on, right? And so these formulas used to calculate, whether it's BPI, health weighted index, type weighted index, or total performance index, whatever, these formulas are constantly being updated as new data come in, right? So these very recent update, April 2020 TPI formula apparently is this, right? I cannot make any sense out of this, other than this protein, fat, so on, right? uh, so these are the different meanings of this. So what matters here is, it's called total performance index, right? So total means it takes everything into consideration. It takes production aspects, which is milk production, life, longevity, conformation, type or anatomy, carving traits, livability, fertility, somatic cell count, health, etc., etc. But again, the majority is production and milk production and productive life, right? So all these are taken into consideration, and that's why they have higher reliability than the predicted phenotype based PTAs, right? So right, so refer to this. So wherever possible, I have given the references, so please do visit these websites and do read up, because they really are important, right? So when especially if you're buying, right, from outside, do look for these, right? BPI, HWI, TWI, or even TPI, depending on where they are coming from, if available, right? So uh, being disease free alone is not sufficient, right? So the take home message from all of this is, I can't emphasize enough the importance of heifer selection, right? Whether you are racing them or buying them, genetic selection is extremely important, right? And you can do that either using, predicted phenotype based PTAs, or using genomic based PTAs, right? Um, but if available, genomic PTAs are definitely preferred. So I can't emphasize enough the importance of this, right? Although in Sri Lanka right now it is not practically possible to do genomic based PTS, right? So but what you can do is you can get familiar with those anatomical characteristics that I outlined, with the udder, with the hooves, with the feet, with the rump, etc., etc. So if you can learn that art and implement that, then you can do a fairly good selection together with some records, looking at previous production records of the parents. You can do a fairly good selection, right? Okay. So let's move on to the next section. So that concludes the first section, which was on animal selection, right? Good replacement stock, and so the next section is breeding management of heifers, right? So when I say breeding management, what exactly comes to your head? Think about it for a minute. What comes to your head when I say heifer breeding management? So what should come to your head? Like, puberty, heat signs, heat detection, artificial insemination, natural breeding, bull selection, right? So pregnancy diagnosis, right? So those are the things that should come to your mind, right? But we are not going to go into a lot of details on things like heat detection and pregnancy diagnosis, because those are taught under reproduction or theriogenology in a lot more detail, right? So what's specific about breeding management of heifers, very specific to heifers compared to cattle, is that compared to cows, is that puberty. Right? So with cows, you don't have to worry about puberty because they have already attained puberty, whereas with heifers, they have not attained puberty yet, right? So that is one of the main things that we will be covering under heifer breeding management. How to identify puberty, how to expedite puberty, how to get it early, the correct timing to get it, and then also followed by when to breed, ideal time for breeding. Right. So now obviously age is a factor that determines puberty, right, among any species, right? Now when it comes to cattle, can you think of other factors that can affect puberty in addition to age? Take a minute, pause the video, take a minute, think about it. As I hope you paused the video and thought about it and came up with things like breed as well as body weight, right? So obviously, different breeds may have, different ages for puberty and also body weight, right? So just because a malnourished cow, you know, becomes 3 years old, it doesn't come into puberty if it does not reach a particular body weight, right? We call it a proportion of the adult live weight or proportion of the adult body weight, mature body weight, mature live weight. So different terms people use, depending on the regions of the country, world, different textbooks, different terms used. But the idea is, from the adult live weight, mature body weight, what is the recommended proportion, right? Um, so for puberty, as well as breeding, as well as calving, there are established, identified best, um, you know, time windows, recommended time windows for puberty, breeding, calving, etc. Right? On the one hand, age. On the other hand, proportion of body weight. Right? So you, as a veterinarian or as a future veterinarian, you need to know what is the ideal age for puberty, the ideal age for breeding, calving, weight at puberty, breeding and calving, etc., etc. are if you are going to be a good heifer manager, right? um, so um, so as you can see here, right, so again, like I said, this depends on the breed, right? For a large dairy breed such as Holstein Friesian or Ayrshire, these are the usually accepted time frame figures, right? So uh, Holstein Friesian heifer, for example, can come into puberty as early as 9 months, right? So 9 months, as long as it comes during this time frame, can be considered normal, right? But if it goes beyond 13 months, then that reflects some kind of a poor management practice, right? So that would be considered delayed puberty, right? So similarly, for so if a heifer calf does come into puberty as early as this, theoretically you can start breeding as early as as early as 13 months, right? But the recommendation is that we breed no earlier than 14 months, right? So you want to go beyond 14 months. I'll tell you the reason shortly. Like we said earlier also, right? Our goal is to get a calf at 24 months, right? We don't want any earlier for certain reasons, which I'll cover later on, right? So 24 months, and so if you want it to calve at 24 months, you want it to become pregnant 9 months before that, which is 15, right? But like I said earlier, they may or may not conceive on the first attempt of breeding, so therefore you want to start maybe 1 month earlier, right? So if it really does conceive on the very first breeding at 14 months, then it's going to calve at 23 months, which is not a very big deal, just 1 month plus or minus, not a big deal, right? So if you breed within this window, it's going to calve within 23 to 24 5 months, with an average of 24 months, right? So that is kind of perfect. It doesn't matter when it comes to puberty, as long as it comes to puberty before 13 months, right? Then you can start breeding at 14 months and it'll calve preferably 23 months or 24 months, right? So that those are the accepted guidelines in the context of, the dairy industry that is practiced in Sri Lanka, right? But now you will see this is not only a function of age, right? You see, it's not one point, right? It's not one point, it's a window, right? You see here, right? So there are, of course, like with anything, even in human population, there are, you know, tall people, where there are very short people, there's, the majority is in the middle, right? And then even if you take the growth rate, some kids will grow faster, they'll become 6 footers as early as, 15 years of age, whereas there will be other people that grow slower and again become 6 footers, maybe when they are 18, right? So there are different growth rates, right? So if you take a really slow animal, right, really slow growth rate, which is 350 grams per day. See, kilograms per day growth rate, 350 grams per day, and as far fast as 1 kilo a day, right? So see, this animal, right, that grows at such a slow pace, right, it reaches, this, so we usually say, it has to reach at least, 45% in general to reach puberty, right? So this animal that grows extremely slow reaches 40% of adult body weight at 20 months, right? So this guy is going to come into heat only at, is going to, yeah, come into heat or attain puberty at 20 months, right? On the other hand, this guy who grows extremely fast, right, he will reach 40% of adult mature weight as early as 7 months. So this guy is going to come to very early puberty. So those are the animals around here, right? So usually we say for an horse nutrition, for a horse nutrition heifer, a growth rate of about 750 grams per day is what we consider to be normal, right? So such an animal, see, such an animal will come into puberty around, 10 11 months, 40 45%, right? Such an animal will come here 55%, which is considered ideal for breeding at 15 months, right? Right. So that's how this goes, right? So it depends on the growth rate, right? So let's say this animal, for example, if this animal, the, let's say, the accepted, uh, it has gone beyond 13 months, still no sign of puberty. So the veterinarian decides to give some kind of hormonal treatment, GnRH or FSH or whatever, to stimulate the process, right? To hasten, to expedite the process. Do you think that's the correct, approach to handle this? No, it is not. See, so it might be 18 months, it might be 16 months, right? But it's still only about 30% of the body weight. So even though you give hormonal treatments, right? For one thing, it may not make any difference. The other thing, even if you do make it come to heat by hormonal treatment, it's still not going to conceive, because the physiological system will tell her, you're not well grown enough, your structure is too small, your something else might not be well developed to hold a calf, right? So therefore, I'm not going to make you I'm not going to bring you to puberty, or even if you come to puberty, I'm not going to make you pregnant, right? So that is the message Mother Nature gives. So instead of trying to do hormonal manipulations, what you should actually do is you manipulate the feed to speed up its growth and bring the body weight to 40% or 45% or whatever, so that it will come into puberty, right? So same goes for breeding and calving as well. Instead of doing all these hormonal manipulations or treatments, right, or magic uh, formulas of any kind, right? What you need to do here actually is to uplift the growth rate so that it will reach these uh, criteria, right, soon, and come into puberty, successful conception, etc., etc. So I hope this is clear to you, the point I was trying to make, right? So neither reaching the age, right? See, now in this example, fast growth, it reaches 40%, right? But only still about 7.5 months. So it doesn't come into puberty yet, right? So it has to breach that, it has to reach that age, otherwise it won't come into puberty, even though the body weight uh, was reached, right? So it has to reach, both the body weight and the age have to be obtained for successful event, puberty or breeding or whatever, right? Okay, so keep that in mind. So like I said, that is the normal curve that is considered a growth curve, right? And so you need to know these percentages by heart. Which percentage of adult live weight should you attain for the animal to be coming to puberty? Which percentage of adult live weight should the animal attain for successful conception, and so on, right? So again, this will depend, this will slightly change based on the textbook you look at, based on where the book comes from. Is it from Australia, is it from US, is it from Europe, which breed are they talking about? Is it Holstein Friesian, or is it Australian Friesians, or is it European Ayrshires, or is it Jerseys, right? So this will depend on the book and the region that you consider. But generally, as shown by this chart, so this comes from Wisconsin EDU, university, so that's USA, right? So in the USA, usually what's considered is, about 45% adult body weight for puberty, 55% adult body weight for breeding, and 82% adult body weight for first calving, right? So that's what they consider. And also, 9 to 13 months for puberty, 14 to 16 months for breeding. And so actually this particular one, talks about early breeding as early as 13 months, resulting in the first calving of 22 months. However, in our system that is not practical, and even in their system, as I'll be showing you shortly, there are shortcomings of doing that, right? Because sometimes people want to calve early because they think, okay, now I got my first calf early, so then I get a second calf early, maybe I'll be able to squeeze in an extra lactation, right, within the cow's lifetime. But that's actually not beneficial, right? Especially if it has not reached the recommended body weight, right? So let's look at some of those. So to do this, right, what you need to know is what the adult live weight will be, right? So that you need to know, otherwise you wouldn't be able to do this calculation, right? So like I said, I mean, one could ask, right? If they come into puberty as early as 9 months, right? Why do you wait till 15 months to breed it, right? I mean, if it comes to puberty at 9 months, you breed it at 11 months, you'll get a calf as early as 20 months. Isn't that better than 24 months? See? So this is a study done by the University of Pennsylvania, not University, Pennsylvania Dairy Herd Improvement Association. It's a quite old study. Nevertheless, it gives you the data you want, right? So they show out of Holstein heifers in Pennsylvania, right? Some animals calve as early as 20 months. The majority, of course, majority of calvings takes place during 24th and 25th months, right? So 12,500 calvings here, 11,500 calvings here, right? But they can calve as early as 20-21 months, right? So why don't we recommend that? I mean, I told you, I specifically told you, don't make them pregnant before 15 months, because our goal is to get a calf at 2 years. Why do I say that? The answer is here. Look what happens. If it calves early, actual milk production of Holstein Friesians calving at various ages. See, animals that calved at 20 months had a very low lactation yield, right? So they gave like 13,000 pounds of milk. In the US, they talk about pounds. Whereas animals calving from 24th month onwards, they are giving almost 15,000 pounds, 2,000 pounds extra, like 1,000 kilos extra milk, right? So that is the reason why we don't recommend uh, breeding before 15 months, or making them pregnant before 15 months, so that you can have a calf at 24 months. Then there are better chances of the cow having good body condition score, sorry, not body condition score, the proportion of adult live weight, it has passed 80% of the adult live weight, right? And it is likely to give a higher quantity of milk, right? Whereas here the animal is still growing, right? Maybe 70% of adult body weight. So part of the feed that it eats goes towards growth, right? And on the other hand, part of the feed that should go towards growth goes towards milk, and the animal becomes smaller, right? It doesn't reach the recommended adult live weight for the breed, right? So neither one of those are good, right? That's why we recommend to keep them until 24 months for first calving, right? Which means uh, breeding, waiting to breed until at least 14 months, even if the cow heifer comes to heat, earlier than that, right? Okay, so I hope that point is clear, right? Okay, so it's not the age, right? It's not the age, right? It's the age, right? But just because the age is there, you shouldn't do it, but you have to look at the body weight as well, right? So the body weight, like I said earlier, so puberty usually takes place after 45% of adult mature body weight is reached. Breeding, 55 to 60, right, depending on the textbook you look at. 82% first calving, 92% second calving. It is by the third calving that animals reach mature body weight, right? So that, remember that, only after the third calving do they reach mature body weight, right? So you need to know these numbers, right? So usually our goal is to get 30% of the adult body weight by 6 months of age for an heifer, right? By puberty, which will be before or at 13 months, 45 to 50. Breeding 15 months, 55 to 60%. First calving, 82%, or above 80 to 85%, right? So that would be your goals as far as body weight and growth rates of heifers are concerned, right? So you need to know these numbers by heart. Now you have to memorize these, right? But you can memorize the percentages, but you won't be able to calculate the actual kilos if you don't know what the actual adult live weight is, right? So you have to know that for your breed, or for the breed of your client, right? So obviously adult live weight is going to be different for different breeds, right? So for large breeds like Holstein Friesians and Brown Swiss, usually this can be as high as 700 kilograms, right? Guernsey and Ayrshire, something like that, and Jersey, you know, this, or in Sri Lanka, even less than. I have not seen a 500 kilogram Jersey in Sri Lanka, right? So yeah, a little smaller than that in Sri Lanka, right? 400, maybe 450 maximum in Sri Lanka, right? So you need to back calculate based on this, right? So let's take, if it's 500 kilograms is your expected adult live weight, right? Then puberty should come at something like 45%, right? Which would be like less than 250 kilos, right? 225 kilos. You expect it to come to puberty. If it's not there, if 225 kilos is complete, and 10, 11 months is complete, there's no reason why it shouldn't come to heat, right? And then if it's 500 kilogram live weight expected, 60% would be 300. And if it's 15 months or 14 months in age, and also 300 kilos in weight, time is ripe for breeding, right? And then you're expecting it to be 400 kilos, which is 80% of 500, by the time of calving, first calving, right? So that's how it goes, right? So you need to know your adult weight, right? Adult live weight, mature body weight of the breed, and according to that you can back calculate the weight for puberty, for first breeding, first calving, and so on. You also need to know this: the average daily gain, body weight gain of heifers for jerseys it should be 500 grams and above. For Friesians, it should be, I mean, again, depending on the management system, you will see different numbers, right? Something like 700 grams and above per day of weight gain, right? Depending on how well you manage, of course. Right. So although these are the numbers we recommend, breeding at 15 months, first calf at 24 months, in Sri Lanka, even in the best farms of Sri Lanka, such as Ambevela, New Zealand, Bopattalawa, right? What we see are, figures like this, right? 18 to 20 months. Breeding resulting in 27 to 29 months first calving, right? We are not able to get the first calf by 24 months, due to poor management practices relating to could be feeding, all the way starting from colostrum management, right? Then feeding, housing, climate, blame everything on the climate, right? So due to all these various factors, um, unfortunately these numbers are a little delayed than the recommendations. If you go to dry zone, for example, numbers are a lot worse than this. I don't have a lot of personal experience in the dry zone, but I hear those animals can be, sometimes 5 years when they get their first calf. They don't come to puberty until they are well past 3 years of age, right? Again, heat stress, poor feeding, etc., etc., could be the reason, and of course genetics. Right. So you have to know, right? I mean, to do this calculation, to back calculate 45% of adult mature weight or 60% of mature weight for breeding, you need to know what kind of live weight am I expecting from this animal, right? So this is, from uh, Holstein, Canada, right? I got this, and this shows the expected normal growth curve, right, for Holstein Friesian weight gain in kilos, right? So this animal here is 90th percentile, which means one of the top high ranking, top 10% animals, right? And this is the 50th percentile, and of course below average animals would be somewhere down here, right? So if we consider our best animals are at least average, we expect Sri Lankan Holstein Friesians to come up to 650 kilos, right? Now you see that kind of animals in Ambevela, New Zealand farm, etc., etc. Or if you go to other farms, usually even if they are purebred Holstein Friesians, they are in this range, maybe 550, 500 upwards, right? But not quite above 600, right? So in context of Sri Lanka, you can take, I mean, by judging by the management, right? You can think, judging by the breed characteristics, is it going to be a 500 kg animal or is it going to be a 600 kg animal, right? Because most of the horse increations you see with small and medium scale farmers are animals that have been upgraded from local breeds, right? So they may be 50%, 75%, 87.5%, but not quite 100% Frisians, right? 100% Frisians, are rare to see in small and medium scale farms of Sri Lanka, right? So obviously you're not going to get these 700 plus animals, right? So you need to know that, and then also you need to know their height. So this is the withers height and hip height, right? So 50th percentile animal at 2 years, nearly 5 feet for both of these, huh? Right? So I mean, in Australia, once I encountered animals at a particular farm. They said that is the farm that has the tallest Frisian in animals in Australia. So those animals, their withers height, they were taller than me, right? So I'm 5'5", right? So their withers height was taller than me, so 65 inches minimum, maybe even more, right? So those were really large animals, right? Now, when you do your research on the internet or whatever, now you see these are also not very new. This is 2014 is what it says, right? 2014 document, right? Now notice, so remember these figures: 700 kilos here and 60 inches, right? Now when I review papers or reports written by students or veterinarians in the field, I see them referring to old textbooks and old publications like this. See, 1955. Growth measures of Holstein females from birth to 7 years, published in 1955. Look at the difference of figures from 1955. Height at withers 135 centimeters, right? So 135 centimeters is just give me a second, right? So 135 centimeters is only about 53 inches, right? So today's the modern animal Holstein Friesian is about 7 inches taller than that, right? So height at withers 5 to 7 inches tall. So this is the reason why you should not refer to old publications, right? I mean, recently I reviewed a paper on, uh, technologies related to artificial insemination, right? And most, at least some of the references I saw were from 1950s, 70s, 80s, right? Now, in a technologically advancing field like artificial insemination or semen, science, right? Even a publication older than 2010 is not acceptable, because science is, very dynamic. It's eternally changing, it's rapidly changing, right? So you have to make sure when you look at things like this, you are referring to, as new articles as possible, preferably within the last 2 3 years, right? Sometimes there are no data from the last 2 3 years, in which case you have to go back, right? But even then you have to try and keep it within the last 5 or 10 years, or no further than that, right? So if you refer to old books, right, this is what happens, right? Okay, so things like, certain things may not change regardless of, age. For example, uh, the number of teats of a cow. Whether you look at a 1940s document or 2020 document, that is not going to change, right? But, there are other things, are going to change. So you should always try to look at data as, new as possible. Right, so that is Holstein Friesians, right? And then Jersey. This is the curve for Jersey, 500 up to 450 kilos, right? 450 kilos for Holstein Friesians, right? So that's kind of like what we can expect in Sri Lanka also, right? Not towards 500, 400, 450 and below. And height, say about 52 inches, 52 53 inches maximum height, 90th percentile, but we are looking at 50th percentile, so we are looking at something like 4 feet 2 inches, 4 feet 1 inch, or something like that. Right, so I hope you begin to understand now why the age and all this is important, right? So why do you think, now I already mentioned about, why the body weight is so important, because if you breed it while it's still growing, right, that energy will go to, the energy that's meant to go towards milk will go towards growth, and vice versa. Energy that's supposed to help the animal reach its adult weight goes towards milk production, right? So that makes that makes, on the one hand, the animal produce less milk, and on the other hand, it stunts the animal, it makes the animal smaller, it prevents the animal from reaching full body weight, right? So that is what is shown here, right? Potential production increase with each kilogram increase in heifer live weight at calving, right? So that's the 82% weight, right? So for each kilogram increase, right, for each kilogram during first lactation, it will produce 4 liters extra milk. Second lactation, 8 liters extra. Third lactation, 8 liters extra. So for each kilogram during the first 3 lactations alone, it will produce 20 liters extra milk, right? That is for 1 kilogram. But if you can make your cows 50 kilos heavier than your neighbor's cow, right, they are going to give you 50 times 20, which is 1000 additional liters of milk. 1000 additional liters of milk, uh, you know these days there are certain farms that sell milk for as much as 120 rupees per liter, right? So 1000 liters extra, that's 100,000 rupees, right? So that is the kind of money that can change your farm from a losing uh, enterprise to a profiting enterprise, right? So this is where you need to be smart and you look at these small numbers that actually shift your business. I mean, this is a business, right? Your business from a less profitable to more profitable, or from a losing to gaining business, right? So you get not only more milk, more fat, and more protein as well, right? So if you recall, we said post weaning body weight gain is related to pre-weaning starter intake, calf starter intake, right? So if you can make your calves eat more calf starter, right, the higher body weight gain they will get post weaning, and the higher body weight gain they will have at puberty, at breeding and calving, and the higher the milk yield in adulthood. So remember that all this is tied together, right? It starts from the point of calf starter, right? So from the point of calf feeding, it accumulates all the way up, right? So you can't just go and feed your heifers just before parturition and increase body weight. That is called compensatory feeding. You are trying to compensate for previous losses, right? So that is not always successful, right? You have to start this as early as pre-weaning period and follow proper management best practices, right? That's how you make dairy profitable. You can't just intervene in the middle and do magic, right? So that you need to realize, right? So that concludes our section on breeding, right? So we've covered two topics so far: selection of animals for high genetics, and then breeding animals. So we will stop here because it's already been almost a 2-hour lecture, and we will break it up and take the other two topics on a different lecture, right? Thank you very much, guys.